Hello everyone and welcome to Phoenix Gaming. We are in our temporary studio today. It's been a while since I've posted. Life has been very busy. As I've mentioned before, I moved into a new house, went to a wedding, hence the new cut, and we laid out a bunch of floor, which you'll see when we finally finish the new studio, which was a fun little project that also took forever. We've got a lot of exciting events coming up soon. World Series of Board Gaming is coming up in September, which is the primary thing that I'm talking about in this video. World Board Gaming Championships, or WBC, which is like the best board gaming convention as far as I'm concerned, is coming up in just over a month. I'm going to make a video about that very soon as I prep for that and put together my schedule for that event. But today we are talking about the World Series of Board Gaming. By the way, if you are planning on attending this event and haven't attended before, I'll drop a referral link in the thing below, in the description below. I can't get you any discounts this time, unfortunately, but you can help me out, I guess, if you want to use that referral link and you're attending for the first time. If you are a watcher of this channel and we haven't actually spoken face-to-face yet and you are attending any of these events, please feel free to come up and chat with me. I'd love to chat with you about the channel. But that being said, let's get into what we're talking about today. Last year, I did a video on the 16 WSBG games talking about basically their variance and their player skill. And today I wanted to rate them on something kind of a little bit different. So we've got 6 metrics that we're going to rate all 16 games that we're playing this year. First is just the variance level. And I found that variance, I actually asked a Discord group of friends how they felt about each of the games. And I found that very easily they went into 3 buckets: low variance, medium variance, and high variance games. They all tended to be pretty clustered together in those specific buckets, except for maybe the medium variance ones. Then I'm going to talk about whether I think more of the variance in that game comes from the setup of the game. Is it at the beginning, or is it throughout the course of the game and the playtime? I also want to talk about input versus output variance. If you are not familiar with those terms, input variance I'm going to loosely define as something that you see and then you make a decision. So like a tableau might be set up and then you choose what's off that tableau based on kind of what's been there. Output variance is more that you make the decision and then something happens. So the classic example is Risk, where I decide I'm going to attack you, I roll the dice and see how that works out for me. So input in advance of your decision, output after your decision. Then I'm going to talk about expertise versus just knowing the basics of the game. This is something where I think I just kind of want to talk about like how much of a leap I think it is from having played a handful of times and being generally pretty good at games versus like this is a game that you could really spend hundreds of hours on and just continually get better and better and better at. Kind of similar, but a little bit different. I want to talk about familiarity versus winging it. There are some games that really advantage you for like knowing every card in the deck, and other ones where it's like, yeah, if you roughly know it, you're probably fine anyway. That does seem like it's very similar to expertise and basics, but the first one is more about strategy, and the second one is more just about like knowing what cards you can see and coming up like that. I would say if you were preparing for this event, the difference between these two is that on the left, expertise and basics requires practice. You got to play. In the middle, familiarity versus winging it just requires you to study a little bit. Frankly, you could get good at the game by knowing the basics often and then maybe just studying. I apologize if you can hear some grass in the getting mowed in the background. And then the last one is just whether I like the game or not. Without any further ado, let's hop in because I've got some folks coming over and we'll see if I can do this at the speed that I'm hoping to do this at. Game number 1 we got here is Acquire. So Acquire was in our high variance category, I'm pretty sure. Yes, indeed, high variance category. Acquire has actually pretty much no setup variance. It's all in the playtime. It's sort of like how you've drawn your tiles throughout the course of the game and how other people are playing throughout the course of the game. Do your tiles match with those tiles? Do you have the matching tiles? This is a very, very heavily playtime variance focused thing. Acquire, I'm actually going to put in the middle between input and output variance. You get your tiles and then you decide kind of where you're sprawling out from there. But that being said, it's more like output variance when your opponents play their tiles or when you play your tiles and then you see what your opponents have. So it's kind of somewhere in the middle. I think that this game it's a little bit ambiguous and depends on how you define variance. I'm going to put it smack dab in the center for this one. Expertise versus basics. I do think that you can get away with knowing how to play this game pretty well, pretty quickly. You don't need to know too many complex things to get through it. I'm going to put this closer on the basic side, and I don't think that's to say that it's a simple game. I do think that as you play more, you get better. But I think that when you learn the rules, it doesn't take too long to catch yourself up. Familiarity is useless in this game. You don't really need to know anything. You can pretty much just wing it every time. So after just a few games, I think you're going to know exactly what the vibe is for this game. And if you've listened to me talk about it before, I'm not a big fan of Acquire. There are just a couple of older design parts about it that I'm not a big fan of. I don't like memorization, which is kind of a key component of this game. I think that it's very feast or famine. I think the game is very win more. And so those are things that make it not really stand out for me. But I do respect that it is a game from 1968 that still is very respectable for the modern age. So gotta love the fact that it has stuck around for ages. Next, we've got Brass Birmingham. Brass Birmingham is one of the very few games that my community rated as extremely low variance. I think this makes a lot of sense. You do not have any setup variance in this game, but you do have playtime variance. But I think the variance actually in this game is quite focused on it should be in the middle here, because there is setup variance in terms of like where the merchants are on the outside at the beginning. But you get your cards throughout the course of this game and you decide how to use them. I think the low variance aspect of this game is that many of the cards have multiple purposes, and you're really just faced with the challenge of what you can get away with. I find that in Brass Birmingham, the variance is sometimes you can get really bad luck. It's very hard to get very good luck, and it's pretty rare that you get that really bad luck. In general, it's just kind of like throughout the course of the game. I would say that this game is closer on the input variance side. You are getting your cards and then deciding what to do with them. In fact, you don't even draw new cards kind of in the latter turns of the game. So smart players are sort of crafting their hand to figure out what they want to do in those final half of each of the eras. So I definitely put this more on the input variance side of the game, which I think, by the way, does correlate with people's interpretation of whether a game has a low or high variance. I actually do agree that Brass Birmingham is pretty low variance. I think that it's a game that, how do I say this? Brass Birmingham is a game where if you have a specific game plan, you are almost certainly going to be able to execute it. It is more about the little efficiencies that you get with your cards that you want to respond to and your opponent's play that you want to respond to that make the big difference. So that's where I think that low variance feeling comes into play. I think Brass Birmingham greatly rewards expertise in the game. People that have played this game a lot are just definitely better than people who have played it just a few times. As somebody who played a fair amount of Brass at Lancashire, I find myself having to sort of like rework my brain and go through the whole thing again. In terms of familiarity to deck or winging it, actually this is closer to the wing it side. You don't really need to know how the deck is constructed because there's a little card that tells you how to do it that you can reference at any time. And frankly, a lot of those like flows are not that important. I maybe could see putting this in the middle here because you might have a sense after a few additional games that like, oh, these cards are, going to show up more often. It really matters. Like you can't get to Nuneaton very easily or whatever, but I'm going to stand by the original rating and rate it on the low side. I quite like Brass Birmingham. This is not one of my favorite games ever, but I've been enjoying learning it and playing it more and more. I think my main concern about Brass Birmingham is I don't see the games playing out very differently from game to game. It's definitely a very tactical game, and I'm definitely more of a strategy player than anything else. So I'm going to put this in the middle, except for my Google Sheets doesn't seem to want to write numbers anymore. There we go. All right. That's Brass Birmingham. Let's move on from here. Hello. Okay, we're going to talk about Wingspan next. Wingspan amongst my group was weighted, I believe, medium variance? No, high variance. My group said that Wingspan is high variance. I do think it makes a difference about whether you're playing with the power birds or not in this game, so that is something to consider. Playtime variance and setup variance are really interesting in this game because there is more playtime variance over the course of the game, but the setup variance is actually more important. Your first initial birds are really going to dictate the course of your game, and what happens throughout the course of the game absolutely does matter. I'm forced to put this at a 2, but I really want to put this at a 3. I actually think your opening hand in this game matters really more than any of your luck for the rest of the game. I would take a good opening hand and bad later draws because most of the birds are close enough that if I have 1 or 2 good birds at the beginning, I'm going to put myself ahead. But I will acknowledge that good draws throughout the course of the game do also really help. So I'll put it right in the middle. There's variance continually throughout the course of this game. Whether this is input or output variance, I think is a very complicated thing. We roll the dice and then you choose if you get the food. But sometimes you get the food and then you roll the dice. And that can lead to some really interesting moments. With the cards, you get to see cards from the tableau, but if you don't like any of the 3 that are out there, you draw off the top of the deck. So I think this game actually has a lot more output variance, even though there are decisions that you make after the input. I'm going to put this smack dab in the middle, but I am leaning more towards the output side. Expertise versus basics. I think that a person can get pretty good at Wingspan pretty quickly. I would have originally, upon learning this game, put it in the basics category. I've spent a lot more time trying to learn it and be good at it last year. And so actually, I'm going to put it closer to the expertise. I was impressed at how much better I got at this game through the course of playing it. Over familiarity with Wing It, because it's Wingspan, I have to put it in the Wing It category. Obviously, that's just a low-hanging fruit joke. It's actually a 2. I think that knowing the birds in the deck, what can come up, what birds are good and what birds are bad is really, really important. That being said, I don't think that it is a very long or hard crash course to learn which birds are better than other birds. Most of the birds are in, I would say, just like a couple categories. There are some that are head and shoulders above the others. There are some that are like definitively awful, and then the rest are like pretty interpretable throughout the course of the game. So I put that smack in the middle there. In terms of liking it, I used to be a kind of like Wingspan naysayer. I have come to like this game more and more over the course of time. I'm going to put it in the middle. Again, this is the last slot. Okay, I'm going to put it in the middle here. I do like playing Wingspan, but it's not the game that I would choose to take off the shelf. Very middle of the road for all of these votes for me. All right, moving on, we got Dune Imperium here. Dune Imperium is a game that our group, I think, rated medium variance. Now, that's, I think, not too surprising. You have a really small, it's a small, slow deck building game where you have to make sure that you are manipulating your deck, and you can control that quite a lot, but still those moments of whether I'm going to draw these 5 of these 7 cards, I do think really matters. In terms of setup versus playtime variance, I think it's almost entirely in playtime variance. You're going to be drawing completely random intrigue cards, or whatever they're called. They're not called intrigue cards. Hopefully you know what I'm talking about. What you draw off your own deck is obviously fully variant. There's extremely little. In fact, I don't even think there is any setup variance, so I think it's pretty easy there. In terms of input versus output variance, you decide how you're going to manipulate your hand as you're playing throughout, but you don't know what your opponent's intrigues cards look like. Are they good for this combat? Are they not good for this combat? I think this actually is a lot more on the output variance side of things. Not that you're not making a decision about how much you put into combat. You're just kind of gambling on what your opponent has. Like, can they support this with extra cards in their hand, or can they not? Do they have another card that will let them play an XYZ location, or won't they? There's not really a ton of input variance in this game. I would actually say the things of input variance, I would say, is what's on the tableau of cards to buy, and like whether you choose to reveal early or not, I guess, is in your control. The other thing that output variance is like really high in this game is I buy something and then flip something for the next player to open up. So I think this game is definitely on the output variance side of things. Expertise versus basics. I think the fact that there are so many YouTube channels dedicated to just this freaking game show that it is a game of very high expertise. It rewards knowing those lines. There's a lot of little edges you can get in this game and like right sequences of play that you go through that mean that you play it in the first time, you play intuitively. Oh, I know how to play worker placements. I know how to play deck builders, and you'll play okay, but you're going to get crushed. And you'll be surprised because it doesn't seem like you should get crushed. But knowing where those pressure points are is very, very important. The other thing about this game is that I think it's a game that rewards familiarity. There's a reason that there's tier lists for every single card in the intrigue deck, every single card in the deck. Like, you want to know what's good, what's bad, the asymmetry of the starting leaders. This game rewards practice, it rewards studying. It's a game that if you want to be good at it, you need to put in the effort, I think, in advance. It's really hard to just pick up and be good. I am middle. You're going to see this a lot, me being kind of middle on a bunch of these games. On Dune Imperium, I enjoy playing it, but I've not had the desire to go as deep as others do. I don't personally find this game to be... I like games that have a little bit more space. I do like that this game is very tight and focused in those times, but it has a trait that I don't like in games, which is when I can see halfway through the game that I am doomed and can't do anything about it. And I think this game staunchly falls into that category, which is the thing that prevents it from being a very good game for me personally. Cascadia. Okay, I have come to love Cascadia, playing a bunch of practice with my mom last year. It's one of her favorite games. I know a couple other people who really like this game too, but I think there's no question that this game is on the higher variance side. That being said, my community said it was medium variance, and I think that's fair. I think a lot of the stuff is actually quite similar, and you're looking for these little edges rather than big swingy things, which is why it lands on medium variance, even though it is kind of lots of stuff being pulled out of the bag. I think there's very little setup variance in this game, but there's tons of playtime variance in terms of what is being revealed at what times. I guess you could argue that there's setup variance in terms of what the initial animals are, but everybody gets to interact with those equally, and I don't think that one particular animal setup benefits like player in seat one versus anything else. So even though the setup is different from game to game, I think your variance is going to show up throughout the course of the game rather than anything else. I am going to say that this game is on the output variance side, because the variance that shows up is what things get flipped out of the bag. You have absolutely no control over like what's getting flipped out of the bag. You might be like, well, Nick, you said input variance was things get revealed and then you make decisions about them. And that's absolutely true. So fair call out for you calling me out or me calling myself out in this instance. I don't want to get into a long dithering thing about why input versus output, why I think that output's the appropriate definition for what I'm talking about here. But essentially it's that my decisions, I think, the variance is a result of my decisions rather than my decisions being a result of the variance, I would argue. Okay, expertise versus basics. I thought this was a game that you could get away with the basics, but actually understanding the patterns of scoring and which kind of setups reward which certain things, I think actually do give you some benefits for expertise with this game and practicing, and you can definitely get a lot better by playing over the course of time. However, there's really no advantage, I think, to studying the cards in this game. You can just wing it and you're good every time. Do I put Cascadia as a 3? I think probably not. Cascadia sits as a 2, but it's really close to being a 3 for me right here. I do definitely like playing this game every time. It's not going to be the one I'm going to pitch, but I'm happy to play it anytime someone wants to ask me to put it on the table. Alrighty, moving on from here. Let's cooperate, mouse. Great Western Trail. Well, everybody knows that this is one of my favorite games. If you're watching my channel, there's a really, really good chance that you're here because of this game. We're just going to get this out of the way. It's one of my favorite games of all time. This is one of the other games that my community rated as very low variance. There is an interesting balance of, I think, setup and playtime variance in this game. The way that the original building tiles and the loop is set up really makes you have to think about how things are structured in this game, and that's probably the biggest moment of variance in the game, but everybody gets to interact with it equally, except for maybe you could argue seating order or whatever. But I do think that it's important to acknowledge there's a fair amount of playtime variance in this game, like where you're drawing cards out of your deck, the order that you're drawing cards. I think that in general, there's a decent amount of control over that if you are moving at a pace that is not blisteringly fast. And so playtime variance is funny in this game. I think that when you first start playing it, it feels very lucky. When you start getting good at it, it feels like there's no luck. And then when you get really good again and you're playing with people who are very good, you see all those moments of luck really, really shining outward. I'm actually going to call this game really high on output variance. Now, people might be surprised to see that, but I think the main form of variance that you're going to encounter over the course of this game is the cards that you draw from your deck. And if I'm drawing a card that gives me $2 extra on a delivery and you aren't, that's going to be $2 extra that I had for really no strategic choice of my own. And I don't see a ton of input variance going into this game where things are being flipped and then I'm making those decisions, except for at the setup. I definitely think this is on the heavier output variance side. Now, there might not be a ton of it, but that is something that I think is very true, and I think something that is overlooked by players of this game in terms of talking about like how it is and how it goes. So just at me in the comments or whatever, or we can argue about this in real life. I think this game, obviously I'm super arrogant. I think this game really, really benefits expertise, tons and tons of practice. I've played this game hundreds of times. I think that playing against someone who's played less than 100 times, it's very likely I'm going to beat them. I'm looking for people who are probably playing at the same level of insanity that I am. This game just really, really rewards knowing things in and out, play patterns and everything like that. That being said, studying this game is only so helpful. I guess you could like understand the buildings and the building interactions and everything like that. What are good spots on the route to drop various pieces? How much can you expect, certain hazards to come out, or what the victory point distributions are, anything like that. But I don't think that this is a game really worth studying. In fact, I would put it closer to 1.5 here rather than a 2, but I think it's more a 2 than a 1. So that is Great Western Trail, our beloved. Tickets a Ride, the cursed game. All right, well, it's the cursed game, so we already know where that's going to go in terms of our favorites rating. Our community rated this as very high variance. In terms of setup versus playtime variance, yes, you have variance over the course of the game in terms of what cards you draw off the top of the deck, which you're going to be doing a lot of. The person who gets a lot of wilds. I am going to argue that the most important variance in this game is those initial tickets that you draw right at the beginning of the game. I'm talking about base Ticket to Ride here. We're not talking about any of the 1910s or Europes or your Marklands or Indias or whatever. I'm just talking about Ticket to Ride US basic version. I think those initial tickets make a huge difference. And so I'm going to put this in the high setup variance category. I think this game is a fully output variant. Everything you're drawing is pretty much off the top of the deck. You're rewarded for drawing off the top of the deck. And those tickets are also just completely random. Expertise versus basics. Again, this is a game that I thought you could get away with just knowing the basics, but having a little bit of expertise does help in understanding the flow of the game. I think this could be closer on the 1 side. This is like a 1.5. I'm actually going to put it at a 1 just to, drive the nail home about how much I don't like Ticket to Ride because it is the cursed game. I actually do. I found myself liking this game more and more over time. But this game actually really rewards your familiarity with it. Knowing what tickets are in play, what tickets are available. This is a game where studying for the game is maybe more beneficial than even playing the game after a certain point. And that's actually straight from a player that I know that went to like the US Ticket to Ride national competition or whatever. That was a big part of what he did, was studying what all the routes are, and he had all 20 whatever of them memorized. Splender's a game that I suck at. I am perplexed perpetually about how I am as bad at this game as I am. Seems like I should be good at it. People tell me how to play, and somehow I still continually lose this game. My community rated it as medium variance, which I think is fair. I think this game is fairly high on the playtime variance versus setup. There's not a lot of changes at the beginning. Obviously, if the flop is like one good card for the first seat to draft, then that's, I guess, a big part of it. There's definitely an advantage to first player in this game. That's notable as well. But I think outside of that, you're mostly how are things going to play out throughout the course of the game? Who gets in your way? In terms of output versus input variance, I actually think this is mostly like deciding along the way. Actually, it's not a lot of times where you're just drawing randomly. I guess the one thing is when you take a card off the board, it's what you flip. Can it be very good for your opponent? Maybe I should actually put this in the middle. So I think this is somewhere in the middle. I'm having a hard time with what the variance in Splender is like. I guess it is kind of in the middle because we are just, if I like have a very heavy like black and red gem strategy and more black and red gems come off of the, victory point decks, tier 2s and 3s, that's just beneficial for me. So yeah, we'll put that there. Basics versus expertise. I mean, I hate to say it, but I just see people who know what they're doing crush people who don't know what they're doing. The experience and practice in this game makes a really, really big difference. That being said, I think that the familiarity level is probably in the middle, like knowing roughly like what color patterns tend to go together, how much things cost is going to be helpful for you, like what those relationships are. But this is closer to a 1.5. You can probably wing it. In terms of my joy of Splender, I've never super liked this game and I suck at it. So I think Splender's got to be in the one category. I'm really going to avoid playing this any opportunity that I can, except for the practice for this event. Moving on, we got Castles of Burgundy. Castles of Burgundy is a game with dice, so, take with that what you will. My community rated Castles of Burgundy as medium variance. I'd agree with that. I think you have a lot of control. I think this game is like, what was the other one I was talking about earlier? Losing my train of thought, but it's you roll those dice, but you still have a lot of power over what choices you're making. Brass Birmingham is the one I was saying the same thing about earlier, and we rated that one as pretty low variance. So I think Castles of Burgundy does scratch on the lower side of variance for people who really know what they're doing. I think that the variance is important in setup, but there's essentially 5 setup rounds. And then there's the variance that you get of like what dice you roll. So I'm actually going to put this in the middle because both of those things matter, right? How every round gets flipped out, what tiles are going to get flipped, what your play order is, various things, and then what your dice that roll. They do make a difference. You could say that good players are going to win anyway, but I still think it is absolutely true that having rolls that cooperate with what you want your plan to be is going to save you resources and then ultimately save you actions along the way. I think that the setup variance is on the input side and the playtime variance on the output side because you are rolling those dice. But by the time those inputs have revealed, you've already made the decisions like, do I want to be going first next turn and take a lot of boats? So I'm actually going to put this on the output variance side. Maybe that's just my bias towards what dice are going to do in the course of a game, but hey, there we are. In terms of expertise and basics, I see people who are good at this game crushing it all the time. It's probably a little bit confusing to me, but I'll put this in the high expertise category. I think versus familiarity and wing it, you have to understand the value of the different kinds of tiles. Actually, maybe I should even put this at the 3 because people have like specific plots for the different maps that you play in the game and what those look like. Castles of Burgundy is a completely fine game for me. I'm never super excited, but I'm also not offended to play it. Moving forward, we've got Arc Nova. This is a really interesting one. Arc Nova was rated as a medium variance by my group. I know there's going to be some people who are going to be like, what? Arc Nova is a very skilled game. I mentioned this last year in my video. I think that this is a high variance, high skill game. I don't think high variance, so I think medium variance is an appropriate place to put it. You have both setup and playtime variance in this game. You just draw few cards, and those cards are really, really important. You have some control over what those cards are, but a lot of times you're going to be drawing off the top of the deck. Those like initial cards you get at the beginning for bonus scoring, they're just not created equally. I think that the variance really matters, but because this game snowballs, it would be a 2, but I'm going to put it at a 2.5. I'll be aggressive and put it at a 3. I think what your first couple rounds look like in this game is more important than anything else that happens in this game. I think it's closer on the setup variance side of things. The input versus output variance question is very, very real. I think it has been demonstrated by the expertise of many people who are very good at this game that knowing what to pick up, where to pick up things, where to push your luck, and so on and so forth, suggests that this is more on the input variance side. But that being said, there's definitely something to sort of the, I flipped out such and such animal and you're about to snap something off of the top, like off the row, or you draw, one of the eagles off the top of the deck. Just how many friggin' like strong sponsors you start with at the beginning of the game also depends on whether you're playing 2 or 4 players for that last thing I said, but I think that this is closer on the output variance side than it is on the input variance side. I'm going to put it on the output variance for now. No, I think it needs to be both because snapping off the deck really matters, so it's a hybrid there. We're going to be pausing after this because I see my guests are arriving for a game, so let me finish this up. I think that we've seen that people who play this game a ton are absolutely amazing at it. It's a very, very high on the expertise. I think you really want to know the play patterns in this deck, the different cards in this deck, where the animals I can get, which partner zoos associate with what possible cards I could be drawing, knowing what cards are in the deck, what could be drawn, which opponents can be doing based on the things that they're doing is a really, really, really big deal. This is a game that requires a lot of practice and a lot of studying to be good at. I quite like Arc Nova. I've cooled on it a little bit. It's probably closer to a 2.5 for me right now, but we're going to put it on the high rating side. And we're going to pause for now. So apologize if you see me in a different background later, but we will get back to it. Thanks for watching. Don't mind the abrupt, complete state change. I'll get my stuff organized soon. Let's hop into Raw. So Raw was rated by my community as very high variance, which makes sense. There's definitely a huge push your luck mechanism in this game. I do think that properly being able to evaluate things in this game is very, very important. But the way tiles come out and that like kind of pushing to the end of the round luck mechanism is definitely quite feelable in the game. It happens throughout the entire course of the game. This is definitely on the playtime variance side. There's actually, I think, basically no setup variance in this game. The whole thing is tactics. You're just kind of like measuring from round to round what that's going to look like, and how those raw tiles come out. Huge amount of output variance in this one. You certainly could argue that like you are making your decisions after tiles have drawn, and you are doing that like evaluation component. But in terms of like what is going to come out in the future, right? You're not making an evaluation on the pieces now, knowing what the other comparative pieces are going to be in the future. You're making those estimates of what my evaluation of this now based on what I think things might look like in the future. And I would definitely consider that to be on the heavy output variance side of things. I do think that Raw quite well rewards experience in the game. There's a guy at WBC who's like won it like 4 years or something ridiculous like that, but it does definitely tend to rotate who's winning and losing. I think that you could probably learn this game pretty quickly, but it does take some time to understand the valuation of things. The timing and tempo of this game is just not like a lot of other things. I think it stand out on its own in that way. But you're going to hit a ceiling at some point about how much better I think you're going to be getting at this game. I do think that familiarity with this game is very helpful. However, they have kind of printed the tiles on the board. So I don't think that the like studying component is that helpful. You're going to get a lot more of a feel for the game by playing and practicing it than spending the time like knowing that, oh, there are 25 Nile tiles because it just says that on the board. So I don't think that you need to spend your time studying the components of this game. You should just practice instead. I quite like Raw. I think Raw is a really, really good game. I think that it is nice and fun and strategic. It is quick. I think that it does what it does really honestly. It is a pretty wild game. Like things can just kind of happen. You can kind of just lose or someone can kind of just win, and that is how it goes. So if you're down for that kind of experience, I think that Raw is very, very good. Great. Let's moving on. We're gonna head over to Azul. Very fuzzy Azul picture here. So fascinatingly enough, in my community, this was rated as a medium variance game, but it was the least variance rated of the medium variance game. In my community, people think that Azul has less variance than something like Arc Nova does, which I think is really, really interesting. That might be, I think, because of this heavy setup variance component. Nothing is going to change over the course of a given round. You're going to pull a certain amount of tiles out of the bag, but it's not that wild. You're going to pull, 20 of each color tile out of the bag. So that it's not going to throw you off throughout the course of the game. You're not going to make a decision and suddenly something else flips out. So I think folks feel a fair amount of control. It really brings up this question that I haven't talked about now, which is opponent variance a part of the variance in games? Like how people play or how they choose to play, does that impact how the variance of a game feels in general? I think Azul is a game that is very much like that. And I think, as we were just discussing, this is very, very heavy on the input variance. Like you are going to see what is or isn't going on pretty early. I'll say that the one thing about output variance that does show up in this game is if you're kind of planning, you have a certain row, you think that a certain number, like color of tiles are going to come out, and it's early before the bag reshuffle, like you could get kind of unlucky with which colors of tiles are like sparse or highly available. But I think that is a smaller component than what you're going to see as the game sort of sets up, and then you have to make the decisions from there. I think this is a game that's almost entirely based on your experience with it. I think that practicing this game a lot is really going to pay a lot of dividends. I do think you're going to hit a ceiling at a certain point in terms of those, play practice experiences. I don't think that playing hundreds and hundreds of times is going to make you that much better than somebody who's played dozens of times. I think there's absolutely no reason to study this game. I think that you'll kind of know it. So Azul is actually the opposite of Splender for me. Both of them came out at similar times. They were kind of like really hyped at the time, lighter games, and both of them I kind of was like whatever with. I did not. Like I said, I haven't really grokked Splender. I don't really like it as much. Azul has only grown on me over time. I really like the clicky clack of the colors. I like the way that the scoring in this game works. I enjoy playing this quite a lot. All right, that brings us past Azul and on to Terraforming Mars. You might already know that I'm definitely a big fan of this game. It's a game that I've played a fair amount of times over the years. My community rated Terraforming Mars as pretty much smack dab middle of the pack in terms of variance. I think this is a fair statement. The cards in this deck are deeply not created equally, and even with the drafting component, there just isn't going to be it's going to be something where a lot of stuff is going to come out. I would actually even argue that Terraforming Mars could push into the high variance thing. You do see the same people winning, but I just think that the cards are just really really imbalanced in this game in a way that understanding that imbalance is definitely a skill. But it does feel very variant when you're playing at higher levels. But, same people keep winning. So I think that's something certainly to acknowledge and recognize. This game, I can't actually pick whether it's heavier on the setup or the playtime variance because you're going to draw a bunch of cards throughout the course of the game. But where you start, actually, this game is very snowbally, so I'm going to put it on higher on the setup variance. Your initial corporation, your initial draft of cards is just so much more impactful than the other components in the game. I think it is entirely fair to say that this has playtime variance. This is like a 2.5 for me. And it's only because that initial hand is just so very important. But those card draws throughout the course of the game do absolutely matter as well. So we're going to put this in the middle here. I just think that the variance flows and it keeps flowing throughout the course of the game. I would describe this game as a lot more on the output variance side of things. You are drawing cards off the deck and you really don't have a lot of control. Like, you make the decisions of which cards you pay to keep, and that's probably the best mechanism in this game. Is every card costs you $3, so you have to evaluate, like, is this good? Am I going to play this in the long run, or is it worth the cost that it is for me to keep it? But what cards you get is totally out of your control. I think there's actually very little that you're deciding, like, the game has revealed this to me and now I'm going to make this choice. So I would put this on the output variance because I am just randomly drawing cards constantly. This game heavily rewards expertise, experience, having played it a lot, understanding the play patterns. How does this map work versus this map work? And I think very similarly, a lot of familiarity is very helpful in this game. Knowing the cards inside and out, the tier lists and everything like that really matters. I think this game is quite expansive, there's just a lot going on. If I was going to step back on any of these things, I think that the familiarity is very important, maybe even more important than the expertise. So I could put the expertise at a 2 and the familiarity at a 3. I just think knowing what you're supposed to do on this map, how these corporations are, is important, and someone can download you those skills. So it's worth it certainly to practice it, but I could see doing this 2-3 thing rather than 3-3. And I quite like Terraforming Mars, as you might already know from the way I've talked about it in this video or in other videos. Heat's a newcomer to the pack. Folks have rated Heat as a high variance in my group. I think that's a little bit unfair to Heat. I would say that it is on the higher variance side. It's probably like a 2.5 to me. But I do think it kind of sits in the middle there. There are just not enough cards in this deck manager. There's no building really in this game that you definitely have a sense of like what's going to happen. You can kind of like manage, and your expectations are there. But when you draw, the right cards at the right time, when you do sort of the stresses, I think you're primarily supposed to be playing stresses when you really know what it is that you're going to be getting out of them. But sometimes you just don't have those choices. So definitely on the higher variance side, Okay, I take it back. I'm actually going to put this as a 2. I was going to say that it's almost all playtime variance with it, is how you're drawing cards throughout the deck, but actually I'm realizing that if you're playing the garage module, which you should, it's just kind of the best version of this game for gamers, I would say. But even for folks that are not heavy into gaming, it's just a fun, quick little draft mechanism that gives everybody some asymmetry. And that setup variance is different, is important. Those cards are not created equally for sure. This game is quite heavy, I would say, on the output variance side of things. You could argue that the cards, because your hand size is 7, which is relatively significant, that this is maybe closer to like the middle of input-output variance. You're not going to play through all 7 of those cards on a given turn, but making sure that you draw the right cards at the right time. This game also literally has those like card flip moments where you put, you do your boost or you use the plus and you don't know what it is that you're drawing into, and some are good and some are bad. So I think this is pretty heavy on the output variance side of things. I think that this game does certainly reward expertise. I might get some people who, I know there's a handful of Heat fanatics out there who think that kind of really testing this game in and out, like you can get tons and tons of skills, but I think at a certain point you'd really know what it is that you're doing. I actually think more than anything, this game is really high on the familiarity. Knowing how the tempo is on each of the tracks, the rating system for each of the garage modules, how you're supposed to interact with the different like weather tiles or roadmap tiles that are out there, I think makes a really big difference. So I would say the familiarity, you could spend more time studying this game and getting good at it than practicing this game. And I dig Heat. I think that I would put Heat's probably like a 2.5 for me. But I'm going to put it as a 3. It's a game that I'm actually considering picking up. It's one that I could throw in front of gamer and non-gamer friends, and I think that they would all quite enjoy it. I think that it is nice, whippy, fast-paced. I think a problem with this game that is also its greatest benefit, it's kind of like a fun dance between a 2 and 3 here, is its catch-up mechanism is so strong. It makes everybody feel like they're playing the game, but it also does mean that the early decisions in this game kind of don't feel like decisions. The game sort of bumps you forward, but it is just a lot of fun to play. So I am generally a fan of Heat. I'm very curious to see how this is going to play out and feel like at WSBG this year. Lost Ruins of Arnac is our other new game this year. Lost Ruins of Arnac, my community rated as medium variance, which I think I agree with. There's a small deck building component, a lot like Dune Imperium. What you're drawing out of your deck, which of your 5 out of your 7 or 8 or 9 cards can make a pretty significant difference. And so there's also like what cards are available to you when. So I think the variance is a fair claim here. Setup variance versus playtime variance. I would say this is probably heavier on the playtime variance because there's not a whole lot of variance in the setup. Obviously, like what happens right at the beginning matters, but flipping out which explorations you get or new cards as they're getting bought, you're going to see a lot more in the playtime than you are in the setup. And then this is kind of an interesting hybrid between input and output variance. I'm going to put it as a 2. The map kind of has actually, I'm going to take it back. I'm going to put this more on the output variance side because the more I'm thinking about it, the more things are on the output variance side of the game. So what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about the fact that I buy from a row and I make a decision of those cards that come in a row, but then a new card comes out. And this game for me has so many times where I buy a card and then I feel like I just helped my opponent out more than me because of the new card that flipped off the top of the deck. It was just better than the card that I had, or it was just because the cards are not created equally and they are kind of diverse in that way. It's just a lot of those like kind of feel bad moments. It's just like a handful of cards that just like flip random resources. Every time that you're going for an exploration, those are random resources. I would say this is more on the output variance side, and is how you're managing that output variance. Those like resources that you're getting, do you have enough time over the course of the round to make them work? It dances between a 1 and a 2 for me. I'm going to maybe leave it at a 2 here because I think I've heavily argued that things are output and input throughout the course of this. So we'll say that it kind of lands in the middle, mostly because I'm struggling to come up with a good answer. I do think that this game absolutely rewards expertise. I thought I was really good at this game, and then people started getting really, really good at it, and now I feel like I'm kind of just middle of the pack. So I think it's maybe a 3 in expertise. I think that it's going to take a chunk of games to get pretty good at what it is that you're doing. I just don't know if it's hundreds though. It's It's between a 2 and a 3 for me. Floats in between these. Let's land on the expertise really matters. I think familiarity in this game is important. Understanding the value of each of the different cards and which ones are more powerful than the other ones matters. But I think after a handful of times or a couple quick studies, you can sort of pick out the ones that are really powerful and the ones that are really bad. And there's a lot of stuff that's fine. I really liked Lost Ruins of Arnac when it first came out. I think the management of the resources is really good, but I'm going to put this actually as a 2. Part of the reason for that is that I have found that this game is just very snowball-y. It feels like when you're ahead, you keep being ahead. When you're behind, you see that person who's just ahead. Everybody gets to do something in this game, but I think that feeling of like being stuck there in terms of the base game just doesn't feel great sometimes. Knowing that you're kind of trudging towards a loss, like being just an awkward resource here or there away obviously is the challenge of the game. I do really like that this game has pretty easy math, but it challenges you to manage your resources more than I think a lot of other games of this style. So I do think it is very good, but it has fallen out of favor for me in the time since I've learned it and played it. And then the last of our new games is Earth. I've spent a fair amount of time studying for this year, trying to actually increase my expertise with it. And so I actually have a lot of opinions about this one because I think this is likely the game that I'm going to be playing at WSBG on that day. Not a lot of other things that are really competing for me. Folks in my group rated Earth as the second highest variant game. The highest was Raw, by the way, which I don't know that I personally agree with. I think there's a couple other games that I would put up there. But this game is definitely very, very high variance. There's a huge stack of cards. The cards are just so unbelievably imbalanced with each other that variance is just, it's very, very notable. The snowballing in this game is super duper real. While your variance is going to you're going to draw a lot of cards throughout the course of the game, cards at the beginning and everything like that. While you are drawing a lot of cards over the course of the game, and I should really rate this as a 2 because you have your initial setup, you have your later setup. I'm actually going to put this into the 3 category because of that snowball concept that we were talking about. I think your starting cards, your starting hand are just so incredibly important. There are certain setups that are going to lean heavier towards the playtime variance side, but you think it's really funny that I'm saying there are certain setups that lead towards the playtime variance side. Those setups are things where it's like you need to draw cards that are green. You need to draw cards that are in bold text or italics text or whatever. That's going to mean that the playtime variance is going to matter a whole lot more to you over the course of the game. But I think just those initial cards and your game plan sort of in the first 2 rounds of the game is really going to set up a lot for how the rest of the game is going to look. It probably does realistically sit at the 2, but I am going to put it at a 3 just to really, really make that point that I am trying to make there. In terms of output or input variance, you're generally just drawing random cards from the deck. You have very, very little control over that. You might not even get cards that help you draw more cards, so I think this is heavily on the output variance side of things. Expertise versus basics. I do think that just playing this game with general Euros, like you're going to be okay, and playing it more and more, you're going to learn some skills, but you're going to hit that skill ceiling, after some dozens of games, I think, or maybe even 10 games. Like there's a certain point you just understand what it is that you're doing. You're drawing cards, you're efficiently paying out your resources, and so on and so forth. I think it is more important in this game that you actually have familiarity. I'm rating both of them as a 2. I think that the familiarity part is very, very important. So the importance of this is like a 3, but the difficulty of it is like a 2. I think you could spend not a lot of time studying up on this game. I could give you kind of like a crash course on like what are good cards and what are bad cards, and those like kind of heuristic rules I think would really help. If you were going to spend your time learning this game, I would spend more time familiarizing myself with it than practicing it, because I think that's going to pay dividends just in understanding what cards it is that you want to play. It is going to require some expertise to maybe understand what that familiarity looks like, but that's how it is. I'm going to put this game as a 2. I do think that it's got its flaws. I think it's got its really deep flaws, but I admittedly have had a fun time playing it. I think one of the reasons that this game actually plays to my strengths as a player is it requires you to juggle a lot of different information. I don't know that I think that's necessarily good game design as a core concept, is like requiring people to to like juggle that many scoring concepts in their head, but it is something that works well for me on my side of things. And I believe that brings us to the end of all 16 WSBG games. If you watched all the way through here, really appreciate it. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed this video. Maybe throw me a like. That gives me YouTube algorithm stuff. So maybe throw me a subscribe if you haven't, because hooray, YouTube algorithm stuff. But I hope to see some of you at the WBC or WSBG, and we'll get another couple videos going soon as I get my life more in order. Have a wonderful day, everyone.